How do we grow this influence of black leaders, men and women, that can represent our industry inside the ANC, inside the policy-making structures?
Get to grips with the digital environment, put together best practices, what works and what doesn't, very importantly.
In the project that we're doing in Chaplati, we've created a linking bridge between those two little areas there. So it becomes a matter of just 10 minutes walk from one side to the other.
So my message to our CEOs and those chief investment officers is, where at the end of the day do you want to see your role?
So by treating all of our water back to a stage where we can bring it back into the process, we're in effect saving around about 35% of our water usage on site.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Gordon Brown, and this is greeneconomy.tv. So we have again today for you the Circular Economy Show with special guest Chris Whyte, who's a director of the African Circular Economy Network. But before we get started on our topic today, a word from our sponsors.
This show is brought to you by GBCSA's Positive Impact Magazine.
Great stuff. Chris, welcome as always.
Hey, Gordon, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, thank you. So today we're going to be speaking about the waste stream, if you like, of agricultural residues. We're going to talk about what's happening with these waste streams or these materials flows currently, and some ideas as to what potential could actually be unlocked with these waste streams or materials flows, not only in South Africa, also touch on Africa and perhaps look at some global best practice. So, Chris, without further ado, perhaps I could ask you to introduce the topic to us from the point of view of the current problem case, or if you like, from the case of what we're missing out on in respect of this particular topic. So give us a propeller view, if you like, and perhaps just touch on some of the key streams of agricultural residue that we're going to look at today.
Sure, Gordon. Thank you very much. Agricultural residues are quite a significant issue in the country. If we talk about total waste streams in South Africa, around about 108 to 110 million tons a year of waste. To put that into perspective, we all talk about municipal waste, which is probably about 26 million tons of that total. The rest of it is made up of mining waste, fly ash, and agricultural residues. And the numbers are quite significant. So if you look at the typical sort of annual production rates, and I'm not sure how up-to-date the information is, but we're looking at around about 15.3 million tons a year of wood waste. Somewhere in the region of 13.5 million tons a year from maize, wheat, and sunflower. There's about another 3.5 million tons of waste from the sugar industry. And that's just from the agricultural residues. That's before we start looking at the further refining and processing of those products. So if you look at something like wood as a prime example, we have a huge amount of wood in or forestry residues in both in Mpumalanga and KZN provinces. They account for about 80% of all of our wood waste or our wood resources. The Western Cape, not too much in the way of forestry, but they've got some of the best systems in terms of measuring agricultural residues. In the Western Cape, it's about 3.5 million tons a year in terms of agricultural and forestry waste, but there's not much forest there. So the bulk of it comes from the forestry sectors of Mpumalanga and KZN. And I was involved many years ago looking at trying to understand the issues around wood waste and the opportunities in that, and they are significant. So wood is a highly wasteful industry. If you look at the fact that once you've grown a tree, what eventually ends up in the system is probably only about 43% of that entire product. The rest of it is lost in thinnings, which is in the growing period, trying to make sure your tree grows straight and that you don't have big branches at the bottom, so you get your tree thinnings. Then you have the trees cut down after, depending whether it's pulp, after 7 to 10 years, or a saw log after 15 to 21 years. And then all of the branches and trimmings and the tops and tails are waste. Those are often just burnt in the field. Then it gets debarked. That's another loss of the product. Then it goes to a sawmill, and the cutting process produces offcuts, chips, blocks, sawdust, and shavings. So you end up with a tiny portion of the tree ultimately left, and then that goes through to furniture manufacturing, where again it gets sawn, cut, shaved, etc. So there's more products that come out of that. So what you ultimately end up with is a very small portion of what you grew in the first place. And unfortunately, a lot of what we do in this country is really at the low end of trying to deal with those products. So they're either openly burnt in the field. There are some small applications in terms of looking at charcoal production with wood residues. But if you add to that the opportunity in other wood waste applications through the likes of the Working on Water program, where we have this huge initiative across the country looking at alien vegetation, there are again massive resources of woody biomass that we don't utilize. And that's just one aspect of it. So when you get into maize and wheat, you look at the stalks and the husks and all the other waste streams that come from that. Very little of it is going to any sort of high value property. Some of it's being used from land spreading, some of it's used in composting, and a lot of it is used just in heat production. So a lot of the products can be put through a boiler in terms of generating energy or heat for steam production. But we're missing out on a massive value chain. And I think that's where we want to try and unpack the opportunities for a circular economy from not only a South African perspective, but an African perspective, as to how we can look at extracting maximum value from these agricultural residues.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Chris. And let's talk about wood for a moment. And then once we've sort of plowed the depths there, we can go to some of the other agricultural residues, and that pun was not intended. Nevertheless, if you were to go around to these, let's say, wood industries key areas or nodes around the country, and you were to see these piles of residues, and you had a magic wand that you could just point at those residues, and immediately there'd be an apparatus, there'd be a business, there'd be a businessman, there'd be a piece of equipment, there'd be people working, and there'd be value created. Perhaps give us like the top 3 or 4 most obvious beneficiation opportunities that you would want to see implemented using these residues.
Ideally, what we want to see happen is to look at the maximum value that we can create from these different products. And we've got some really clever people in this country and a lot of sort of world-leading scientists that are developing opportunities and applications in terms of what we call biorefineries or bioapplications. We have our own Professor Bruce Sitole from the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research doing amazing stuff in terms of looking at the value add on agricultural residues. And it's not just wood. I think he's playing with feathers and all sorts of other strange things. But the application higher up the chain is to look at extracting maximum value. So one can create wood vinegars from wood. You can do ethanol production. There are systems using waste carbon that would be able to create urea as a organic replacement to chemical urea fertilizer applications. And then further down the chain, we've got applications, obviously, with energy. But we can look at gasification and look at intermediary steps, where with wood waste, for example, we really haven't unpacked the biochar market yet and the opportunities and applications for agriculture and other possibilities in the value chain. as well as taking that to a higher product like activated carbon, which is receiving huge prices per ton on the international market. And again, utilization in multiple different sectors and industries. So I would say that if we want to look at the top end, we need to understand the extraction processes to maximize the value through either a fertilizer, an oil, to look at a biochar or an activated carbon. I mean, those would be some of the ones that I would look at. And there are many different ways of looking at that extraction. And I see that there was a comment came through on bamboo. We must just pick up on that as well while we're on the conversation. So there's many different ways that we could look at it. Again, we've got to understand Africa is a big place. So the biggest issue is around collection and logistics, moving product to centralized places where one can look at production. But we have that often already in place. If you look at the KZN sawmills, a bulk of these materials go to Richards Bay ultimately. And there are hundreds of thousands of tons of wood waste that end up in and around the ports. So a lot of that collection is already done. So let's look at the low-hanging fruit. And we've already tried and looked at energy. The wood pellet market has been tried and tested in this country. Again, it doesn't really make sense to me to look at a pellet, which is for domestic heating production in Europe, when you're now taking our waste and processing it and then shipping it 8,000 miles on a dirty steam or dirty oil ship tanker 8,000 miles north to a European country. It kind of offsets the carbon benefits of that. But again, how do we develop a local market for wood pellets? And how do we look at developing local markets for biochar, activated carbon, oils? Oil extraction is enormous, not only for pharmaceuticals, but in the industrial sector as well. So many applications.
So yeah, thanks very much indeed there to Mr. Boshoff for that comment. I definitely want to ask you, Chris, about cultivation of different species for feedstock. But before we get on to that, you mentioned the fact that, we've got, these clever scientists and innovators and researchers and people that are able to bring through the technology. I'd like to contribute to that and say we also have excellent business people, clever entrepreneurs and people that can make things happen. Why, perhaps talk us through some of the examples of where these technologies or ideas or principles or applications that you speak about have been implemented elsewhere in the world, perhaps, and in South Africa, and to the extent that they're not being implemented, what do you put down, or what would you ascribe the sort of lack of advancement in these areas?
Well, there's a number of reasons. And again, it comes back to one of the topics we discuss constantly on the show, is the issue around certification, compliance, regulation, legislation, and just trying to get a project off the ground in this country is problematic. From a timber perspective, there's always issues with regards to risk. So, to grow pulp trees is 7 to 10 years. To grow a saw log is 21 years. So you're going to invest in something with no return for 21 years. A lot can happen in this country in 21 years, as we've seen. So it is a high risk issue. But we're also a water scarce country, and we need to look at the issues around the water allocations that we have. Agriculture, forestry is one of the main users of our water resources, and we raised that in previous discussions with Benoit Leroy, looking at the water circular economy. And we have complicated systems here, like the creating a water use license application, or a WULA, which is, many people in the industry, if you mention WULA, they go pale and get into deep stress, because it's a complicated, expensive, lengthy process to obtain a water use license. And if we look at the applications and the opportunities, there are some fantastic solutions. But if you look at something like bamboo, as Mr. Boshoff explained, you've got to understand that the technology and the applications are so advanced now through silviculture applications, and the opportunity in terms of splicing these systems. You're actually ending up with a non-fertile or an infertile system that's not going to invade local species. They are far more efficient in terms of water utilization. They are far more efficient in terms of their fixed carbon production and their carbon sequestration and the amount of biomass they can produce on an annual basis. Similar to Paulownia trees or the aluminium wood tree as well, which is also a massive opportunity for this country. We have the right climate for it. But you're now bringing in a different species, even though, again, it's an asexual species that's sort of cultivated in a silviculture lab. There's a lot of resistance to bringing in these new systems and products. We have the same issues in terms of if we wanted to grow jute or jatropha or hemp. We have similar sort of issues. We've been trying to get the hemp industry going in this country for a while, and it looks like it's starting to gain traction at long last. But there are massive opportunities in terms of different crops and different applications. So even if you look at political and social stability can be a problem if you're trying to invest in a 10 to 20 year crop with forestry, for example, in terms of land redistribution, it is a massive threat. The social unrest, as we've seen recently, can be a problem. So there's a lot of problems from that perspective, but also in terms of accessing water use licenses and getting your environmental authorizations. So we have a pretty robust agricultural sector here, but changing it is difficult. We're very much in sort of timber, maize, sugarcane, very simple sort of stuff. But we need to diversify our agricultural inputs. We need to look at higher producing yields and more intensive systems. So there's a lot of opportunities for us to try and develop that. But at the same time, we've got huge opportunities in agricultural residues right now, which we're not utilizing to their full potential. So whether that would be from a direct waste to energy or looking at a gasification, pyrolysis, biochar, one could look at this in many, many different ways.
Yeah, and of course, I mean things like bamboo, for instance, that can actually be converted straight into a construction product, and that's also true of a number of other residues as well. So you don't even need to overly process the product. It's about, I guess, gathering it, getting it into a central point. Firstly, it's a question of acquiring the residue as well. I'd just like to make a quick point to viewers out there. You can communicate with us on social media. Please go ahead and do so. We gladly receive your comments and comment on those. So thanks very much indeed. But so Chris, talk to me about just access to these residues. I mean, are there problems there? I mean, are people willing to give up these residues? Let's say, for example, a sawmill talking about sawdust. If you want the sawdust, is it an issue, or can you just pop along and say, look, I'm happy to take all the sawdust off your hands and I'll bring in a truck and let you go? Or is supply side also actually and potentially ironically a key impediment as well?
No, the supply side is not really the issue. The supply side is more a case of that we have people are very willing to get rid of their residues. The wood sector, particularly, if you look at offcuts and sawdust, are a massive problem. Shavings might have a value in the market as animal bedding and other components. So yeah, there are certain products that they may generate value from, but then there's also others who may be using some of that in their own boilers for their own heat or steam generation. But on the whole, it is a big problem. It's a big
so my understanding, part of the reason for posing that question is that I was under the understanding that one of the key challenges, for example, to investing in technologies such as biomass to energy equipment and so forth, which these are not 20-year investments. My understanding is these are more sort of 5 to 10-year investments with relatively short payback periods. But one of the big obstacles to launching these types of projects is security of supply. So obviously, part of that bankability equation is a lender needs to know that you've got a fixed source of supply that's not going to dry up or double in price over the period of the initial contract. So perhaps just comment on that.
Well, security of supply in terms of the current processing that we have with regards to our sawmills and our lumber yards, as well as our sugar processing centers. We're already solving some of the logistical issues anyway by taking them to central processing points. So access from a volumetric perspective is not a major hindrance. The application or the problem comes in often to looking at the investment and looking at the systems of investment as to how you get products into the market. And we have, I think very few people realize, we actually have guidelines with regards to ethanol production in this country to look at a specific percentage of blend that we needed to get into our fuel system. And our deadlines were ended, I think, in 2015, 2017, and we were nowhere near even 10% of the deadlines that our own government set. And a lot of that is because of the other issues in terms of procurement, looking at the costs, the system development and application of those different projects. So there's a lot of blockages in the system. And again, getting new technology in requires the EIAs, the waste licenses, air emission licenses, water use licenses, and all sorts of other complicated processes. But we have much more advanced technology nowadays, which is cleaner to the environment and better for the environment. And the fact that we burn most of our cane is nuts. There are a lot of countries that will not burn their cane. And they actually look at combine harvesting of cane as opposed to our process of burning. It's also an issue with regards to perhaps the landscape. We might have a bit more steeper land with our sugarcane in terms of looking at non-burn systems. But the applications are there and the opportunities are there. But its implementation has been a problem.
Talk to me about, let's move away from, and you've touched on already, talking about sugarcane and so forth. Let's move away from wood for a moment and just talk about some of the other key agricultural residue that we have in this country. And possibly, if I could ask you, let's go a little bit further afield, start talking a little bit about neighboring countries as well. And to what extent does it offer opportunities to entrepreneurs to look at neighboring countries for pilot project opportunities, because these countries firstly also have excellent bio waste streams, but perhaps are less regulated in the ways that are slowing down these types of investments in South Africa?
There's some big opportunities that are happening. I think that we've seen this through a lot of the recognition from the European Union to look at project development and circular economy development within Africa. And there are a number of options that we're looking at currently through the United Nations Development Program and UNEP, as well as the likes of the IKEA Foundation, who are looking at systems around forestry and food residues, agricultural residues in the likes of Rwanda, Nigeria, Ethiopia. There are some fantastic opportunities in terms of developing more circular economy based type policies and frameworks in terms of economic development. And we are seeing that being embraced in a very big way by the likes of Rwanda, who are probably, I would say, leaders in terms of forward thinking with regard to sustainability and circular economy in Africa. And we need to encourage those applications. There's also a critical understanding of the need to move away from conventional systems of commercial forestry. So people now need to understand that there's perhaps more value in conservation and biodiversity with natural forests. In a place like Rwanda, from a tourism perspective and a biodiversity perspective, than there would be from a a wood extraction component, and a lot of that goes to conventional fuels such as charcoal. Very destructive processes that have eradicated many of our forests across Africa. But also looking at residues that can be utilized for energy, from a anaerobic digestion perspective to gasification. Energy is a big issue in Africa with, as we've said before, 650, 700 million people across the continent without access to electricity. It allows different methods of utilization of these different residues from a very small scale up to local or regional scale to look at energy production. And again, to diversify the energy mix and look at the different applications. And again, focusing on those byproducts. What do you do with the ashes? What do you do with sludges? And how those can be brought back into the system. So there are big opportunities right across Africa. And I think if we think about the Greenbelt area, sort of north of us and south of the Sahara, there's an enormous amount of biomass that's available within Africa, and we need to be pretty clever in terms of looking at our agricultural residue development going forward.
No, absolutely. I mean, just to touch on perhaps some of the forward steps that some people in some industries are making and have made in South Africa. You mentioned sugarcane. We've spoken about wood, and I mean, to what extent has there been advances, and to what extent can we sort of expect, let's say, that within the foreseeable future that we may actually make some key trigger some key advances in relation to these relatively new industries?
There's a lot of different components that are aligning the stars, so to speak. So if we look at for example, carbon development mechanisms, CDMs, or looking at the IREX system in terms of extracting carbon credits, we've really been in a bit of limbo since Kyoto Protocol with regards to what's happening on the carbon credit side of things, and that has been exacerbated by the likes of the USA not being part of the Paris Climate Agreement. But now that they've come back into the fold, we have the new COP27 coming up in Scotland at the end of this year, and I think people are looking towards a stabilization of understanding the way forward with carbon credits. And the agricultural sector and agriculture forestry provides massive opportunities to look at low carbon system development as well as carbon sequestration. And I think that's going to stabilize the environment and create a greater investment opportunity globally to look at these sort of product applications and developments. And that for me is very encouraging, but it needs to be aligned with local assessment, guidance, directives. So if you look at South Africa, we are a signatory to UNFCCC. We are a signatory to the Paris Climate Agreement. We do have international commitments in terms of lowering our carbon. So there are specific requirements in terms of our own regulations with regards to low carbon embodied energy, to building energy efficiency. So there's many different ways that we can unpack that through looking at the utilization of agricultural residues, whether it's from an energy perspective or even if we're looking at bioplastics. And there's a lot of work being done looking at agricultural residues for the development of bioplastics or biodegradable plastics as a replacement to fossil fuels. And again, you look at the offset of that from a carbon perspective, and there are many different opportunities. So we need to grasp the alignment of where we are as a massive opportunity to move forward and create potentially thousands of jobs across the country and expand and diversify our GDP. So we need to jump on the bandwagon now and make sure that we don't get left behind.
What a pleasure. And I think that's a great time to conclude with those remarks there, Chris. So thanks very much indeed. That's all we have time for today, folks. And also, Chris, we see the president of the country, Cyril Ramaphosa, talking about in the media recently, talking about the opportunities in the green economy, talking about green economy as being this conduit for foreign direct investment and for the creation of new industrialization opportunities, which obviously drive all of these things forward. So So, ladies and gentlemen, if you're looking for more information on these topics, greeneconomy.media is always a great source. Chris, maybe you can just remind us of a website that you're associated with where you can get excellent information on circular economy. If you could just give that to us quickly.
Sure, there's a lot of connections through our networks at the African Circular Economy Network, which is www.acen.africa, ACEN. And then we can go there, and if they can't find direct information, there's an amazing network of people they can communicate with.
Absolutely, or just look us up directly through our websites and so forth. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. We'll be here the same time next week, 1 o'clock Wednesday, and we'll be publishing the topic for next week's conversation during the course of the next few days. Thanks very much indeed, and have a wonderful day.
Bye.
This show is brought to you by GBCSA's Positive Impact Magazine.
How do we grow this influence of black leaders, men and women that can represent our industry inside the ANC, inside the policy-making structures?
Get to grips with the digital environment, put together best practices, what works and what doesn't, very importantly.
In the project that we're doing in Chapter, we've created a linking bridge between those two little areas there. So it becomes a matter of just 10 minutes walk from one side to the other.
So my message to our CEOs and those chief investment officers is, where at the end of the day do you want to see your role?
So by treating all of our water back to a stage where we can bring it back into the process, we're in effect saving around about 35% of our water usage on site.